I'd like to welcome to the JPP, the Jewish Philanthropy podcast, David Schizer. David is a 25-year veteran of the nonprofit world and became the youngest dean in Columbia Law School's history at the tender age of 35. He was also the CEO of the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, a humanitarian organization active in 70 countries with $365 million annual budget. Schizer has served on the board of a number of not-for-profits, and for-profits, including is that the 92nd Street? That's not 92nd Street Y, that's 92 NY, 92nd Street Y, right? The Ramaz School, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Field Properties, and Secor Holdings. A member of the Columbia Law School faculty since 1998, Schizer was a leading scholar of nonprofits, tax, energy, and business law, as well as an award-winning teacher. He has taught at Yale, Harvard, Hebrew U, University of Tokyo, fascinating, and other major universities around the world. He also clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Aleha Shalom. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And Court of Appeals Judge Alex Kaczynski. That's the Chicago. That's the Eighth Circuit.
Pasadena, California.
Oh, okay, West Coast. Okay. And Schizer has a BA, MA, and JD, multiple degrees from Yale. He lives in New York City with his wife and 3 children. Dean Schizer, David, it's a great honor to have you here on the podcast today in these critical times. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rabbi. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, great. So let's jump in. So you have a fascinating career and a fascinating life, and you're a fascinating person. I'm going to start off focused a little bit on your time as a Supreme Court clerk, right? That's really a dream job. It's a dream role, right? Many aspiring law students hope to reach that pinnacle of a legal stature very early in their career, obviously, and it's obviously a very select few who get to do it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your relationship with the justice, how you arrived at that particular role, and then how you pivoted from there to kind of I don't want to say the dull field, because it's not dull at all. Like, it's very similar to Talmudic thought in terms of tax law and tax professor. But it seems like, not exactly like what you do as a Supreme Court clerk per se. So I'd love to hear about that.
Well, it was a magnificent experience. I was so lucky to be able to do it. I think it's no secret that Justice Ginsburg had a remarkable intellect. And just to give a sense of that, she looked to us to fill in citations, among other things. I'm saying this, I'd really like support for it. And it was not unusual for her to call me into her office and say, I would like to cite this language, and she'd say what it was. I think it appears on this page in this case, and I think it's in the left-hand column. And she was right, of course, and it just was an amazing thing to see, the kind of memory she had, and also the care and attention that she devoted to her writing was really inspiring. She would write, she would rewrite, and it was a great lesson for a young lawyer like me. So much so that I was sad to leave when the clerkship ended, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next. And I remember in the last week of my clerkship, I went in and I said, Justice, I'd love your advice about what I should do next. And so she looked at me and she hesitated and she said, quite plausibly but utterly unhelpfully, you should do what you want to do. And so I knew what was going on there. She felt that she might have too much influence. She didn't want that responsibility, but I didn't want to let her off the hook. So I said, Justice, what do you think I should want to do? So she laughed at that. And she said, well, tell me what you like, which is also a very important question because lawyers work on different things, different skills. Some of us love to write, some of us don't. Some of us love to argue, some of us don't, all that. So I said to her, I thought I wanted to be an M&A lawyer because I'm really interested in business. But while I've been clerking, I realized that I really love statutes and statutory interpretation. So the justice's late husband, Marty Ginsburg, was one of the world's leading tax lawyers. And so she looked at me and she said, have you talked to Marty about tax? So I did, and that's what I decided to do. And I certainly fell in love with the tax law and have been thrilled to be a part of the tax bar ever since.
Fascinating. Okay, very interesting. I like that. So let me ask you just a few quick questions in terms of one applies to be a Supreme Court clerk. Do you apply to multiple justices? Do you have to pick your justice? How does that process work?
So it is a bit like getting struck by lightning, and you apply to different chambers and you generally will take the offer that you get. And interestingly, some of the justices start looking at you before you do another clerkship. And so I'd had an interview. I had another that I was waiting to do when lightning struck, because I was supposed to clerk for Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Court of Appeals in the
Oh, okay.
DC Circuit. And so one day in the summer, I was coming home from a bar review course, and my mother said, "You've got to put on the TV." And I did, and there was my judge being nominated to become a Supreme Court justice. And so I figured, oh, okay, I guess that job is gone. And just a credit to her and the kind of person she was. Within an hour, literally, within an hour after the press conference ended on the Rose Garden, she calls me personally and says, "Listen, you can still work for me. You can just come right away." Some people say, though, that it's better to do a Court of Appeals clerkship before a Supreme Court clerkship. And my friend Alex Kaczynski has already called me about you. And so his suggestion is, why don't you go work for him and then come to me the year after? I said, sounds good.
Fascinating. And you clerked for her for 1 year.
I did.
Interesting.
Her second year on the court, 1994 to 95.
Interesting. I was just thinking about something also. I see that Senator Joseph Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha, who recently unexpectedly passed away, wrote a blurb on the back of your book, actually, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So one of the outstanding qualities of Senator Lieberman was his ability to cross the aisle. And one of the things I love about Ruth Bader Ginsburg was that apparently she was very, very close friends with Justice Scalia, which I've read about. And she had that quality as well, I think, of being like passionate about her positions, but being able to kind of cross the aisle and respect and hear the other side. Can you share a little bit just about?
Well, unquestionably true. The friendship with Justice Scalia was genuine and close, and they shared a mutual admiration because each knew how talented the other was. I will say I knew from personal experience that Justice Ginsburg was perfectly comfortable crossing the aisle because I'm a conservative. She hired me. We had a very close relationship, and she would ask me what I thought, and it often wasn't what she thought. And she was the justice and I wasn't. And so obviously she made the decision she was going to make, but she always was open to hearing my point of view. And every now and again, I think I persuaded her.
Fascinating. One of the best experiences I had in my tenure as a student at Columbia Law School and as the former dean and a professor, and you'll appreciate this. So we had a course in religious liberty with Professor Nat Lewin, and he took us actually to watch oral argument at the Supreme Court. And I remember vividly we had a private lunch with Justice Scalia afterwards, and they bantered about because they were law school classmates at Harvard. If I'm not mistaken, Professor Lewin graduated ahead of Justice Scalia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, just let's move on. We have a lot to cover. So we mentioned in your bio that you were the youngest serving dean of Columbia Law School in its history. Do you know, just out of curiosity, if any other, has anybody ever been dean of a prestigious law school, a top tier law school at a younger age? Just a historical question. I'm just curious. Has somebody?
Yeah. There was, I know of at least one case. Robert Hutchins, I think was his name, was dean of the Yale Law School at the age of 28. But
Really?
that was in the 1930s. So it was very unusual then. And other than that case, which was 70 plus years before me, I don't know of anybody else now.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Was that a big deal? I mean, how much of a big deal is it? It sounds kind of astounding. I assume your competition for the job were people significantly older. Like, what was going on at that time where that wasn't an issue?
I think it was an issue at first.
Okay.
And I think it took a bit of time for the whole faculty to come around to thinking that it was a sensible thing to do. But it was interesting. My predecessor, David Lebron, who hired me, had announced that he was leaving, and some colleagues came to my office and said, "Would you like to be dean?" And my immediate reaction was, "You mean someday?" And they said, "No, we mean now." And I said, "Really?" And we talked about it. And I think the two defining characteristics of a dean are the ability to recruit the right faculty members and the ability to raise money. And I had already been involved in doing both, even as a relatively new faculty member. I'd only been on the faculty for 6 years. And I think that persuaded some people that I would be a good person to do this job. And I was grateful for the opportunity. And of course, I had a wonderful time doing it.
Why would you be raising money as a professor? Just what's the context of pre-deanship raising money?
It was very unusual. I think I didn't realize how unusual it was, but I had an interest in developing a new program having to do with innovative ways of teaching students how to be involved in transactions. A lot of law school implicitly focuses on litigation, even appellate litigation, and the transactional practice is different. And I was determined to broaden the portfolio of things that we did. And turns out a number of people thought that was a good idea, and they were happy to help fund what we were doing. And so I just naturally got involved in that and enjoyed it.
Interesting. So to pivot from dean of the law school to CEO of a not-for-profit, maybe is a natural thing, a natural transition, maybe not. I'm curious kind of why you made that pivot when you did, and maybe give us a little bit of a framework or a background in terms of maybe just a little bit about your upbringing, what may have influenced you to serve in these roles.
So it's true. I don't know many people who have been the head of an academic institution and also the head of a humanitarian organization. It's not a standard track. On the other hand, both institutions really resonate with me personally, and maybe I'll say a word about why. For me, I've always been focused on the fact that I'm named for my father's father, another David Schizer, someone I didn't meet. He died 8 years before I was born. And so he was born in a little town called Jurin in Western Ukraine. And his parents died of disease when he was quite young. And his grandfather raised him and his two siblings until his grandfather was lynched in a pogrom. And so my grandfather was about 17 when he became essentially the adult in the family, raising these two younger children. And this was a difficult time. The Russian Revolution was raging. It was really a civil war in Western Ukraine. And so one day, a bunch of the Tsar's people, the so-called whites, came to the village, came to that part of Jurin, didn't find any communists, and decided that instead they would just murder some Jews. And so my grandfather was one of the people who was put up against a wall with a few others and literally was about to be shot when some communists showed up. The whites and the reds start shooting at each other. My grandfather and the others managed to slip away in that moment. And that was, I think, the pivotal moment when my grandfather realized that he and his siblings had to get out of there. And within a couple of years, there they were in New York Harbor. And the point is, I have had my own challenges as a young person, mostly as a Mets fan. But the truth is,
I'm a similar sufferer. I get it. Yeah.
So you understand, but seriously,
He had 86, right? But then after that,
he did. What a miraculous year. But look, the truth is, his life and my life would be unrecognizable to him. I've had so many privileges. I've been lucky to do things that I love to do in what I consider the greatest country in the history of the world, the United States of America. And so the truth is, I owe all of that to him. And I would love to be able to pay him back. I'm very mindful of the fact that when he came to America, he studied to be a teacher at Columbia Teachers College. So universities changed his life, and he became a Hebrew school teacher in Brooklyn and had a very satisfying career doing that. My mother went to Barnard, then Columbia Law School. My dad, NYU, Yale Law School. Universities have helped put my family on a completely different trajectory, and I value that, and so it's been a great privilege. And at the same time, I'm also very mindful of how desperately poor and vulnerable my grandfather and my mother's parents, that whole generation was. And I don't think any of them ever actually were JDC clients, but I know that the clients of the Joint Distribution Committee are in a similar spot. They are hungry, they are sometimes in danger. Most of them are Jewish and experiencing some form of discrimination. And so to me, the opportunity to work at an organization that helped people in that position is the closest that I could come to trying to pay back my gratitude for the opportunities that I've been given.
Thank you for sharing that context. Very meaningful. I think it's clear the answer to this question, but I'm still going to ask it just as a follow-up. I'm curious. Look, let's not pull punches. You have an incredible pedigree. I'm imagining when you were graduating law school, obviously, even after a Supreme Court clerkship, you could have done anything, right? You could have gone to work for a hedge fund. You could have started a hedge fund. You love business. Like there has to be, there is an appeal, I think. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of ways to do the amazing work that you're doing. I'm still curious, kind of like why you specifically chose academia and not-for-profit as opposed to shaping the world from a for-profit perspective.
I think there are so many wonderful ways to change the world, and we have to pick the ones that matter the most to us. For me, I've been lucky to be able to do things both that matter to me and that I love to do. And I really think the greatest gift in life is when you can find that, because every day is fulfilling, and it's also, I don't want to say pleasant, because not every professional day is going to be pleasant. There are challenges and disappointments and frustrations. I mean, that's part of life. But fundamentally, I've loved what I've gotten to do, and I'm incredibly grateful for that.
And what was the pivot to kind of decide, I've spent meaningful time at the JDC, I want to come back to Columbia? What was kind of like, how did that kind of come about?
So I was torn between two loves. The university had given me a 2-year leave. They extended it to 3. Frankly, I had expected that they would do more, but the provost at the time said that if I didn't come back, I would not be a tenured professor anymore.
Wow. Okay.
And I really just didn't want to lose my tenure at Columbia. So basically, the decision was made for me that way.
So you're saying, so you understood when you were leaving to assume that role that it was going to be rather temporary. You didn't know how temporary, but it wasn't like you were going to be there for 10, 15 years, because at the end of the day, you did want to come back to Columbia, even when you left, presumably. Interesting.
I did want to come back to Columbia. The truth is, I was aware of precedents of other people who had been given a lot more flexibility than that. One of my predecessors as dean, Lance Liebman, was able to run a nonprofit for a couple of decades after he was dean. And he worked with an arrangement with the school where he was sort of part-time, tenured, but part-time at Columbia, and then working for the nonprofit. And that's frankly what I had hoped to be able to do. But at that particular moment, the university was less flexible than it had been.
So you were on loan to the JDC, and they called in the loan. Fascinating. Yep. Okay, so this to me is very exciting. I'm going to hold this up for those who are ultimately going to see this on YouTube. This is going to be it's on my pile of books to read. Haven't got to it yet, but I'm excited as a not-for-profit professional. The book is called How to Save the World in Six Not So Easy Steps, bringing out the best in not-for-profits. This is this could be a podcast in and of itself, but we have a lot of other things to talk about as well. But again, I'd love to hear, just like, and I'll mention also that Dean Schizer has been kind enough to offer complimentary copies of this book. So if you go to the show notes afterwards, you'll be able to find out exactly where you could access your free copy of this book. But I'd love to hear just a little bit. I'm an author myself. I've written 2 books. I know it's not an easy task ever to write a book. Why did you do this? What do you hope to accomplish with this project? I have to look, but I assume this is pretty recent, right? This was published in the last
May of 2023, so less than a year ago.
Okay, cool. So tell us a little bit about what this is about.
So I wrote this book because I have a love-hate relationship with nonprofits. And you've heard the love, the missions inspire me. But I have frustrations too. I'd say it's 95% love, 5% hate. But to illustrate that, I'll share a recollection of my time getting up to speed at JDC. And so 2 different meetings with 2 senior colleagues at JDC. So I'll start with the first. I sat down with my new colleague and he said to me, David, I don't care about JDC, not at all, and neither should you. And I thought that's a bit of a startling way to begin the conversation, but I was patient and I knew that more was to come. And indeed, there was more. He then went on to say, I don't care about JDC because I care about JDC's mission and I care about JDC's clients. And so you've come in from the outside And your job is to find things that don't make sense and to change them. And the truth is, I may be one of the people doing things that don't make sense, that need to change. And my point to you is not that you have my permission to make changes. No, you have a moral obligation to make changes because I don't care about JDC. I care about JDC's clients. And I don't think I've ever heard a better formulation of the right way to think about nonprofits than that particular thought shared with me that day, because really it's about the mission. The beginning, the end, everything in the middle is about the mission. It can't be about us. It can't be about institutional inertia and all the rest. So I found that inspiring. And of course, that colleague has become a dear friend over time. I'll mention a second meeting with another veteran who'd also been at the institution for a long time. And it was different. And he sat down and he said, I want to tell you how we do things at JDC. And he went through the details of how he does his job. And I would say every 2 to 3 minutes, I heard the phrase, this is how we do things at JDC. And so at the end of the conversation, I said, listen, we both know how important it is for me to understand the details of our work, and I'm grateful to you. But I want to ask a favor, and the favor is in our next conversation, I'd like our focus to be different. I know that you've been here for a while, and I suspect that there are a few things that you find that are disappointing, maybe even frustrating about the place. And it would be great if you could share a list with me so that we can work on them together. Maybe we can fix some of them. And the expression on his face was not very pleased. And when he came back for the next meeting, he sat down and he said, David, I know you want to hear what I think is wrong with this place, but I'm just going to tell you how we do things here at JDC. So to me, that was disappointing, a missed opportunity, but more generally, what I would say is we must never confuse our love of the mission on one hand with our attachment to the minutia of how we do things on the other, because the world changes. The mission won't necessarily change, but the way we pursue it has to change. And so I think that unfortunately at nonprofits, we see some of that affection for the past in a way that isn't helpful. So the book is about that, and the book is about how to solve that problem.
I really appreciate that dichotomy. I think you find that a lot in the not-for-profit space, that many of us are very passionate about the clients we serve, about the work that we do, less passionate at times about the quote unquote organization or the structure that enables us to do that important work. You can't really do one without the other, but I think that's so just share with us kind of briefly some insights, some clarifications. Obviously I'm sure it's in the book in greater detail of how to effectuate those changes, or maybe how to more align the passion for the work with the container that enables it to transpire.
And that's a great way of putting it, Rabbi, the container and the work. I agree with that. Look, I think the most successful nonprofits are able to do exactly two things really well. And the point of the book is, it's easy to say, it's hard to do. So one thing is they're analytical. They think about different alternatives. How can we advance our mission? And they experiment with them. And they do it rigorously, and they collect data, and they analyze, and they're willing to change the way they do things in order to focus on the most effective way to achieve their mission. And that analysis is critical, and that's half of what they have to do. But the other half is they have to get everybody on board to do it, because having a great idea doesn't get you anywhere unless you can get people who either are volunteering or they're the professionals to actually do it, and to do it with
galvanize the support and the focus, right?
Buy-in is critical, and of course the funding too, because you can have a team that's raring to go, but if you don't have the money, you can't do it either. So really the key is, one, figure out the best way to advance your mission, and two, get everybody on board to do it. And that's the fundamental message of the book. But because this is hard, I then offer different strategies, 6 different steps that people should take in order to get this done. And just to give an example, I'll just mention the first, which is plan. Use the right planning process. And here I'll just share a recollection about JDC, because it is an absolutely magnificent organization, and it helps people all over the world. So many, over 70 countries, many, 100,000 people or more. It's miraculous. And at the same time, the demands on it are infinite, and the organization has to be sure that it's always doing the highest value things. So that's a challenge because the place is, by definition, decentralized. You've got important work being done in Moldova. You've got important work being done in Lod, in Israel. You've got important work done in Hungary, and so on. And so you can't manage this, micromanage it from New York. That would be a terrible mistake. But there does need to be a measure of coordination. And so what I was looking to do was to introduce a new planning process that would produce more efficient, rational allocations of resources and would share information and would otherwise make us even more nimble and more impressive. And to be clear, this was not a broken organization. This was an amazing organization, but even the best organizations can still be better. So the way I started is I thought we needed decision-making criteria, because one thing to keep in mind is if you're the leader of an organization, you can't be involved in every decision. You won't be involved in even 0.1% of the decisions. But if you can encourage people to make decisions in the way that you would, or in the way that you want them made, that is an enormously effective way to manage. So, but again, you have to get everybody on board. And so I knew that I had to do this the right way. And what I did is I arranged 12 different conversations, individual conversations, with the 12 people at the organization who led the most significant programs around the world. And we each had the same conversation. I said, imagine a thought experiment. You have two things that you'd like to do, but you really can only do one. You only have the money for one. How do you make this choice? And it was really impressive. These are very thoughtful people. They care deeply about what they do. This is the bread and butter of what they do as senior managers. So I learned a lot. And I was impressed that there were common themes. And I took the common themes and I wrote a memo, which I then circulated to the 12. And I said, this is a summary of my conversations with each of you. It's not very good. I need your help to make this much better. And the 13 of us are all going to be in New York next week. And I'd like to set aside 2 hours for us to rewrite this together. And that was a very productive session. People were very excited about it. And what came out of that session were 3 questions. And this became the decision-making criteria of the organization. 3 questions are: 1, how important is the problem we're trying to solve? Because if it's not important, why are we doing it? 2, how effective is the response? Because if it's not effective, we shouldn't do it, even if the problem is important. So it's the problem, the response, and then the third is not asked often enough. Are we the right organization to do it? Do we have a comparative advantage? What are others doing? How can we add unique value? And one of the best compliments I ever got was after I left the organization, I ran into a friend who said, you know, David, they're still using your 3 questions. It was very nice to hear.
Interesting. Is that a methodology you employed when you were Dean of Columbia Law School as well, in terms of, I mean, you didn't just come up with that in this context. I imagine maybe you did something like that in your previous role.
So the truth is, I had a different approach to planning, and we need to tailor them a bit to the institution. And so that was, I would say, an improvement over what I had done at the law school. I love it, and I will use it in any opportunity that arises. But again, we certainly had annual decisions that we were making and efforts, and so that there were real parallels, but it wasn't the same.
Okay. Did you feel prepared for the transition? Was being CEO, how similar or different was being CEO of the Joint to being Dean of Columbia Law School?
So I believe that although nonprofits are really different in their missions, and some are startups and some are legacy organizations and some are big and some are small, the same kinds of challenges arise at each. And so I do think that issue of really pushing yourself and your team to come up with the very best approach is necessary, regardless of whether you're a law school or a humanitarian organization or a cultural institution or anything else. I also think the need to get buy-in is critical because no leader is ever going to do all the work herself. And if people don't think the strategy is good, they're just not going to implement it in the way that you want. And of course, the need to make the case to funders is a constant at all nonprofits. And honestly, this can be all of it incredibly fulfilling, and it arises at every nonprofit.
I have so many questions in this area because it's a passion of mine, but we're gonna have to move on in a minute to Colombia and business at hand. But I'm just gonna ask you two other quick follow-ups if I can, not to overdo it here, but I do think it's a question, maybe you address it in the book. How does one differentiate themselves as a not-for-profit? Meaning, I find it's just overwhelming the amount of good that's being done in the world. So many organizations in similar spaces. What's too much? Not everybody has the authenticity or the honesty to say, like, maybe we don't have a competitive advantage in a certain space. I see people coming to my home nowadays who are they're in the special needs space in Israel, but they're pivoting to helping soldiers because they know that's what's selling right now. Like, how does one really stand out? And how do you assess, even as a funder, kind of what's really making an impact and what's kind of, I don't know, add-on or repetitive. I've had people say to me, when I
Yes,
fundraise from them, I'm already giving in that box. It may be a completely different type of organization, but I got that box checked. So
right.
it's a broad question, but I'm just curious, kind of, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is really what that third question is meant to illuminate. What is different about us? What can we do that no one else can do? And I think, first of all, it's better for the organization. And I understand that short-term temptation to say, well, this is hot now. People want to fund this now. We're not really good at it, but hey, that's where the action is, and let's do it. And there are two versions of that. One is we realize now that the most important thing that we can do in the world is that, and we're determined to be the best in the world at it. And I can understand that, and I can get behind it. But on the other hand, hey, that's how we can raise money. And the priority is to raise money, even if we're not going to do it well. To me, that is a catastrophe. It is a disservice to donors to take their money to do something that you're not great at. And frankly, it's a disservice to your organization because our reputations are defined by the work we do. And we should always focus on the work that we can do better than anyone. And this is the way we build the trust to have that reservoir of funding that comes in to empower us to do the things no one else can do as well. So it takes discipline. And I had a friend a friend at JDC who used to like to joke, it wasn't a priority before, but now that we have a gift, it's a priority. And I made him stop joking because it just is exactly the wrong message. But speaking of jokes, I'll share one instance which I think illustrates that point. So I was a fairly new law school dean, and I got a call from actually the parent of a graduate whom I've been getting to know. And he said, I've got a gift for you. I said, what? And he said, I have a yacht that has appreciated and I don't use it, and I want to give it to you. And so I heard that, and I'm a tax lawyer, as we discussed, and I knew right away that that wasn't going to work. Because when you give appreciated property, what you want to do is you want a deduction for the higher fair market value, not for what you paid for it. And when it comes to a yacht, or what tax lawyers call a collectible, you can only get that special extra deduction if you give the collectible to a charity that uses it in its mission. And this is why people give paintings to museums, not to soup kitchens, because if you give it to a museum, they're going to display it. It's used in their mission.
You couldn't use the yacht for fundraising for Columbia Law School, like special events?
Exactly. So I said to him, listen, I'm going to save you some time. Your tax advisor is going to tell you that it doesn't work to give it to us because we couldn't use it in our mission. And so he said, oh, that can't be right. And he hangs up, and then he calls me back the next day and he says, oh, actually, you were right. I knew I was right. And then he said, but I have an idea for you. It's a bit like your idea. He said, I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to teach classes on the yacht.
Yeah.
And I don't know, David, whether you ever watched the TV show The Love Boat.
Yeah, I did.
But
Yeah,
I had an immediate image in my mind of the law boat. And it
right.
not a positive image. So the long and the short of it is we thanked him, but said we couldn't.
Well, I mean, my visceral response makes more sense. Like you think yacht, you think like a social event. You don't think of a law class. But I hear the. I'm curious also. This one last question in this space. You've obviously been privileged to raise a lot of money in your career. Uh, what's the talent? What's the gift? What's the most important thing from your perspective to be a successful fundraiser?
There is an old saying that if you want money, if you ask for money, you'll get advice.
That's for advice. You'll get money.
Ask for advice, you get money. And I think the more general version of this is make the donors your partner. So I mentioned that I have these steps. They all begin with the letter P. We talked about plan. My fundraising chapter is called Partner, because basically, if donors see themselves as fundamentally involved in the work, and that can be by meeting people who are being helped, it can be by actually pitching in with the work, it can be by giving advice. But if they're personally invested in this way, they will be more generous. And so really, the job is to bring people in so that they feel like the organization's problems are their problems too, and the opportunities are their opportunities.
For example, with the law school. So what does that look like with the law school?
So I was dean at an interesting time. I was lucky because the two deans before me had made some real changes, and the neighborhood had been transformed, so that there were people who went to Columbia Law School in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s who simply hated it. The truth is, it was a very tough place without amenities. The neighborhood was not pleasant. And so they were very negative on the school. By the time I joined the faculty years later and then became dean, it was a much happier school. But I could not make the mistake of going to people who graduated in the early 1980s and saying, remember the golden experience that you had at Columbia, I want to give that to other people. If I had made the mistake of saying that, I would have gotten an earful and I would have been shown the door. So what I did instead was to include people in the process of fixing the things that had bothered them when they were students. And it's exactly what we wanted to do anyway. And this phenomenon about the fervor of the converted. I really believe that some people who were the most passionate about the school were frankly people who felt so disappointed by their experience and were really pleased to see that they could be involved in giving a better experience to other people.
I like that. Excellent point. It's funny. I remember in my day in the late 1990s when I was considering a decision between going to NYU Law School and Columbia Law School. I chose Columbia because, frankly, it just was a dream of mine to always go there, and I felt the prestige of Columbia was more appealing. But the reputation at the time was NYU was a much more pleasant place to be in school, and a lot of people chose NYU over Columbia for that reason. So it's interesting. I guess I was in that transition phase where it was already things were starting to improve, but that was definitely the reputation, even my day. So it's interesting. So we don't have so much time left, but in our remaining 15 minutes or so, I'd really love to now pivot to events of October 7th, very much weighing on our minds and in our hearts on a daily basis. We're 6 months in now to this terrible war that was thrust upon Israel. And I know you're standing in a very, very prominent role in, frankly, a very, very troubled space these days. I think many of our listeners are keenly aware and observe the testimony of certain Ivy League presidents in front of Congress. 2 of the 3 are no longer in their positions as we speak. One, I think, at MIT is in fact still in her position, if I'm not mistaken. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how October 7th has affected you personally and your role in particular at Columbia, which those of us who are paying attention are aware there's a very much the campus is a breeding it's a breeding place right now for a lot of animosity, a lot of tension. It's probably better words to use than that, but let's begin there.
So I imagine some of the people listening to this podcast are too young to remember September 11th and how we felt about it. But for me, I felt sad and depressed for at least a year. And I had mercifully forgotten how that felt until October 7th, and I'm now right back where I was. I just grieve about it every day, and the horrors of what happened on the 7th and the horrors of what's happened. So it's just, the whole thing is heartbreaking. I will say that you're absolutely right. The atmosphere at Columbia and a number of other universities has been really charged. And I've been at Columbia for 26 years, and this is different from what I've seen before. So bottom line is there are just a lot of Jewish and Israeli students who feel pain, they feel isolation. And I'll give a bit of a concrete sense of what they experience. So I have a wonderful student who is standing in the hall in the law school. He wears a kippah, and another person from Columbia, not the law school, another school, walked up to him and said, "F the Jews." I know another law student who wears a kippah who went to witness a pro-Palestinian protest. He is very much a supporter of Israel, and he wanted to see what they were saying. And they saw him, they saw his kippah, and someone spit on him. And again, this is not appropriate at a great university. There's another student whom I don't know who is wearing a t-shirt with an Israeli flag on it, and some protesters pinned him against the wall. So he managed to break free of that hold and started running. And they said, "Keep effing running." So we've had just blatant ethnic slurs. We've had even some violence, although thankfully not much of that, very little of that. We've also had stereotyping. There are people saying things like, we shouldn't have veterans of the Israeli Defense Forces on campus because it makes us feel unsafe. And let's just remember that most Israelis are drafted to serve, which means that if you're not going to have Israeli veterans, you're not going to have Israelis, and that's illegal. That's discrimination based on national origin under federal law. So all kinds of problems. I'll just allude to one other type, which is a sense of exclusion and the idea that Zionists are not welcome in some student activities. And I can understand some student activities where the focus is on the Middle East, it's on Middle Eastern geostrategy, politics, human rights, whatever it is. And in that setting, I could understand how they take a position and it might not be comfortable. But I've heard this from, for example, law students who used to represent New York City public school students when they were suspended, and our law students were their lawyers. And that organization joined a very, I thought, problematic statement about Israel just after the October 7th attack. And so some Jewish students felt that they couldn't stay anymore. And to me, it's not appropriate that people should feel excluded from an activity that has nothing to do with Israel because of their views on Israel. So
has anybody, just out of curiosity, has anybody confronted you directly in any way, whether a colleague, whether a student, just directly? Have you experienced any personal discomfort directly, toward yourself?
Well, I think I'm lucky that I'm a tenured professor and a former dean, and so things just aren't going to bother me in the same way. I do think that it's students who feel particularly vulnerable. But I will add that since the beginning of November, I've been the co-chair of the university's task force on anti-Semitism, and that is not a popular institution and therefore not a popular role to play with some people. And so
I can imagine you're teaching a tax class and a student could get up and start waving flag and yelling at you. That would not happen, or that just
has not happened. Has not happened.
And you're not concerned that could happen.
I think I should say I've given a sense of some of the unfortunate things that have happened. The vast majority of people in the community are collegial and civil with each other, as it should be. So I don't want to overstate the issue. But
has anybody approached you who is not Jewish and expressed support or sadness, just out of curiosity?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And I should have said that at the beginning. I was really moved in October by the sheer number of people who just came up and suspected that I was upset and said generous things. And honestly, I think there's a very vocal group that have been really critical, and frankly, I think have said and done things that are regrettable, but the vast majority not. But nevertheless, our task force has been very busy, and
who's your co-chair?
so I have two. Nick Lemon was dean of the journalism school for 10 years, and Esther Fuchs is a political scientist who is at SIPA and in the political science department. And I will say that I am incredibly lucky in having two such capable and committed co-chairs.
And you were selected by the president of the university? How did this? Yeah.
Yes, President Shafiq asked us to take this on and has been very supportive, and we've been quite busy.
Okay. Obviously, free speech, academic freedom, these are important qualities, and academic is connected to campuses, but obviously these are critically important in the world, and particularly in the milieu of university life. How far does it go? Does anything go, right? What are the boundaries, right? Is somebody allowed to basically criticize Israel? Are they allowed to, just like you said, are they allowed to do what they're doing, spitting on Jews, physically assaulting people? Where does it end?
So our first report, which came out in early March, offers suggestions about the rules for protests at Columbia. And we started with that issue because in our judgment, protests were a source of some of the most significant problems. Some of the worst events that we were hearing about had happened at protests or near protests, and they were causing pain. And we had protests in academic buildings and students navigating through them on their way from class to class. I know of a student in one school who had that experience, and because she was known to be one of the leaders of their pro-Israel group, she would be heckled and taunted and frankly bullied going from class to class. And so this wasn't okay. So what we did in the report is we articulated 3 principles that we think should govern the rules on protests at any university. And then we offered specific suggestions about how to be more faithful to those principles. So the principles are, first of all, free speech. In an academic community, there should not and cannot be an orthodoxy. It's not okay to say this view is right and this view is wrong. And we need the freedom to explore different ideas. And sometimes those ideas are wrong and sometimes they're offensive, but it is part of the academic process. And I think a hallmark of a free society that we don't silence people. So what that means to me is it's fine for people to protest in defense of Palestinians. And I may not agree with people who support Hamas, quite the contrary. I think that's a horrible thing to do, but people have the right. And so free speech rights are critical and protests need to be allowed. That's principle number 1. But principle number 2 is that free speech is not a free lunch. And in addition to rights, we have responsibilities. And what that means is, although I have a right to speak, Rabbi, you also have a right to speak. And it is not okay for me to shout you down. It's not okay for me to deface your posters. Or if you're teaching a class, I can't make it impossible for your students to hear you, because that gets in the way of your right to teach and frankly their right to learn. And so everybody has free speech rights. We have to protect everyone. And what that means is we need rigorously enforced time, place, and manner restrictions, which are content neutral, viewpoint neutral, meaning they don't just apply when you're protesting for one cause, but if you protest for another cause, you could do what you want. That's wrong, right? That would violate free speech rights. But free speech responsibilities means there's a time and a place for a protest, but you can't do it in a way that gets in the way of other people. So free speech rights, free speech responsibilities, and then the third point is anti-discrimination, because we're also, just as a matter of values, committed to the idea that everyone at Columbia belongs and everyone should feel welcome and at home on campus. It's our home, everyone's home. And in addition to values, we have legal obligations, including federal anti-discrimination law, and specifically Title VI, which guarantees Jewish students, Black students, Latino students, Asian students, guarantees all of what lawyers call protected classes, an atmosphere free, not a hostile learning and work environment, no discriminatory harassment, and it's the law. So really, those are the principles. And then what we did is we offered specific recommendations.
So, say tachlis, like bottom line, like how it's very nice, and I'll say even flowery on some flowery on some level, but how is it enforced? Like tachlis, how do we ensure that these are taken seriously and accepted by the student body? And if it's not, and if it's violated, how is that being enforced?
So the first recommendation that we made, we were actually thrilled that it was implemented even before our report came out. And that is what I call a speaker's corner approach. You're not allowed to protest everywhere on campus. There are designated places where you can go protest. And when I first started talking about this, some people looked at me and said, "Are you saying the protesters have to go to some warehouse in New Jersey?" And the answer is absolutely not. It should be a central location, a meaningful location. And so what the university has said is it should be in the center of campus, on the lawn, north of Butler Library. It's called the South Lawn or the Sundial. The very center of campus, you can sign up from noon to 6. Doesn't matter what your cause is, just sign up 2 days in advance. You can have the space. And that's it. That's where you go protest. And I think this is a major step forward because you mentioned enforcement, and the old rule was conceptually sound, but very difficult to administer because it said you can protest, but you can't disrupt. And yes, that's the right idea. But then you've got this harder job of figuring out whether you disrupted. So if David and I are both at a protest, each of us is going to say, well, I was quiet and he was screaming. And then the fact finder is going to have to figure it out when in fact we just shouldn't be in the lobby of the law school, period. And so that's been a change. We also were concerned, and we were very candid about the fact that our rules were not being enforced effectively. And needless to say, we said the rules have to be enforced, but that's not a very interesting recommendation because there's sort of a but of course aspect to that. Instead, what we tried to do is we tried to figure out, well, why aren't the rules being enforced? What's the source of the issue? And I think we actually made some real progress there. So I know we could talk for hours about this, but I'll just give you one example to make it more specific. I remember when I was a dean, my attitude about protests was a bit different. And I thought, look, if people want to protest, we'll let them protest. If they want to take over my office as dean, I actually have another office upstairs. I'll just go to that. And I think the premise of that attitude and the university's approach more generally implicitly assumed that the costs of the protests were borne by senior administrators, right? And if that's true, senior administrators are big girls and boys. We can take it. And you don't want to escalate things. It's wrong to escalate things. It really isn't what you want to do. The problem with the current moment is that it's different. The protests costs aren't falling only on administrators. There are large cohorts of students who are experiencing them as painful and isolating. And they should still happen. Let me be clear. No one is entitled to silence people from protesting, but the protests should be managed in a way that they don't interfere with other people's rights. And so the challenge, I think, was a backward-looking view that the only thing you had to do with protests was just keep them from escalating. And I think we were able, as others were too, we weren't alone in this, we were able to realize that some protocols needed to change. And so now, if people are protesting in the wrong location, the idea is that the people responsible for managing protests are supposed to go up to them and say, hey, listen, I just want to be sure you know, but you're violating a rule, and here's a card which tells you the rule. And right now it's 11:15, and so we're going to take a walk, and we're going to be back in 10 minutes at 11:25. And when we're back, unfortunately, we're going to have to start taking names, and there's going to be discipline. But we really think it would be great if you went about your day. And I think just that kind of more proactive.
It's fellow students. It's not like campus security or something like that.
No. These are administrators,
Administrators.
they're
Okay, got it.
professionals, and they'll go with campus security, but it isn't actually the officers who do this. It's meant to be the professionals who do it. And the point is, it shouldn't be confrontational, but at the same time, it should be proactive and persuasive. And I think that that's working much better than it had before.
Okay, I know we have to wind down, but I just want to ask you a follow-up on this, just to clarify if I understood this correctly. And I'll admit, I'm not objective, right? I'm clearly on one side of the conflict. Uh, that being said, it seems to me, as objective as I can be, that and even though what I'm saying may be interpreted differently, but when I observe pro-Israel protesters, they're saying, let them free, like, release the hostages. They're saying, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people are alive, where the other side is saying things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or they're talking about genocide or things like that. So if I'm understanding you correctly, as long as the entire whatever, now they have to be at a certain location, but as long as they're not being confrontational physically with people, they can spew any type of hatred, any type of kill.
Not true.
Okay, so
Not
that's what I
true.
want to clarify. So
But thank you for the
the river to
question.
the sea, I mean, they may not know which river would sea, but they're basically advocating for genocide of the Jews, right? That's permissible?
So there are three principles: free speech rights, free speech responsibilities, anti-discrimination. What I was really doing before was giving you the recommendations for free speech responsibilities, but anti-discrimination is a key part of the picture too. And under Title VI, you cannot create a hostile learning and work environment. And what that means is a number of things. One thing it means is no ethnic slurs, no anti-Semitic tropes, no physical confrontations. But Title VI can also be offended. We can inadvertently tolerate a hostile learning environment with calls to violence. It's not okay. And so I think it's very clear, and the university has been clear, that calls to violence are unacceptable. And I think, David, the more nuanced issue is what actually is a call to violence. So, for example, horrified to say
Palestinian,
that.
you could say that Am Yisrael Chai is a call to violence, right? So I'm saying,
Right. No, exactly. And so, but some things are clear on either side of this, right? I think if someone says free Palestine, that's not, right? And people are allowed to celebrate national aspirations and to urge that they be realized. And, that is, it may be something that people disagree with or not, but that's clearly okay. At NYU, it is reported that one crowd started chanting "Gas the Jews." There's nothing ambiguous about that one.
okay, I got it.
So, but on the other hand, there are some that maybe heard one way and intended another way. And I'll just finish by saying that under Title VI, there is both a subjective and an objective component to the analysis. What needs to be true for a court to say that there's a Title VI problem is one, the protected class, in this case, Jews, but it could also be Black students, Latino students, Asian students, et cetera. That group needs to experience it as discrimination, right? They have to subjectively feel it, and a reasonable person would agree. That's the objective component.
It was reasonable to that, yeah.
The key thing here, and our report really emphasizes it, is the need for consistency. And Columbia wasn't being consistent, and I think now knows we need to be consistent. And here's what I mean. In a number of situations, I think the university over the last few years was quite prepared to defer to the protected class about what caused it pain. And so if people said, listen, using that pronoun for me causes me pain, and so the response was, okay, people shouldn't do that. And I think it was jarring for Jewish students on October 7th when they made similar observations about things others in the community were saying and doing. And the response was not, okay, we'll defer. The response was, but wait a minute, that's not what they mean. And they have free speech rights.
Right.
And so I think there are two things going on here. One is, when we do this analysis, to what extent should we focus on the subjective experience of the audience? And to what extent do we focus on the free speech rights and intentions of the speaker? And I don't think that's an easy question. I will say for myself, I'm kind of a free speech guy. And so my preference would be to allow speech to the maximum extent permitted under Title VI. But other people make the commendable, understandable argument that we're a school and we need to be nurturing and nobody should feel uncomfortable in that way. So one can debate that. But the one thing you simply cannot debate is that the same approach needs to apply across all protected classes, because if we fail at that, we are violating Title VI. That is clear. So I think consistency.
Why, just for example, Harvard, I think, stands out as a campus that's had, particular difficulties. Why can't they get their act together, quote unquote? Or maybe I'm not informed. Maybe they are finally kind of getting things more consistent, like you're describing, or that's not your turf to comment on.
Look, I can tell you that members of anti-Semitism task forces at different universities talk to each other. I've been fortunate to be in touch with people at other schools. I do think the dynamics and the challenges are similar in a lot of places. I also think that the solutions are similar, and I'm gratified that I'm hearing from lots of places that they're reading our report carefully and persuaded by it, and they're looking to implement our recommendations. And if that happens, from my perspective, that would be great, because obviously we're all trying to produce the greatest university environment we can for everyone. And I'm confident that we can do better than we've done.
Are these protesters, let's say anti-Israel protesters, are they all students, or are they, like, I always hear these things about people being paid to protest. I see them, on the streets, I'm saying in TNAC communities. Is it all student body at Columbia?
So I think it's mostly students.
And is there pay to play with the students in some form, or you don't know?
I don't know. I think there are some faculty who feel very passionate about this. They may join. There are students. The truth is there are lots of people in New York City who would be happy to join these protests. And one of the things the university has started doing is to close off the campus on protest days, because, and I very much agree with this, members of the Columbia community have free speech rights. People from outside the community don't have the right to come and protest at Columbia. And candidly, I feel a lot of trust in members of the Columbia community, and they will protest out of conviction and do the right thing and behave the right way. But people from outside the Columbia community, who knows? Who knows exactly why they've come and who they are? And I think the university is right not to give them a forum at Columbia.
Okay, final question. I know we have to end, but I think it's a powerful final question. I think I'm going to guess what I think you're going to answer to this question. I'm not sure I will agree, but my final question is, do you think Jewish parents should be sending their children to Columbia or other Ivy League schools, for that matter, in the current milieu, in the current context of events?
I would say absolutely. And I say this.
I knew you were going to say that.
But let me tell you why you should believe me. I have a daughter who's a junior at Harvard. I have a daughter who's a sophomore at Columbia. I know exactly what their experience has been. And as I pivot away from them individually, I will just observe generally that there have been unpleasant, uncomfortable moments, no question about it. But the overall experience is magnificent. And the opportunity to get an education at a place like that is really, really meaningful, and has been for years and still is. And I also want to emphasize, and I probably haven't emphasized it enough, that there is a vocal group of people who are saying and doing things that I find disappointing. But the vast majority of the community is not a part of that. And there's a great deal of sympathy for and goodwill for Jewish students. So it's a very comfortable place to be still. It hasn't been perfect, and we've got to make it better.
I appreciate that response. It reminds me, somebody once gave me the following imagery, which I found very powerful as a former pulpit rabbi, that often when you're in a small congregation, it's like a charity box. When a charity box, like a stucco box, a metal canister, if it's all full with change and you shake it, it's not going to make a lot of noise. If there's only like a few coins in it, it's going to make a real racket, right? So it's often something that we try to reassure ourselves. in the collective milieu, if you look at the polls, most Americans support Israel, but unfortunately, the most vocal elements are the minority. But the minority feels like the majority because they're so vocal, and the supporters maybe are quietly kind of and everybody has their reasons why they don't want to wade into somebody else's battles. But it's definitely a complex dynamic. I can definitely say that, myself included, where it used to be like a real badge of honor to say you were a graduate of certain institutions. It's not necessarily, our proudest moments, but my hope and my wish is that you and other like-minded individuals are going to continue to succeed with the important work that you're doing on campus, and hopefully, because I can appreciate that free speech is a value, and that part of life is tolerating things that are not always comfortable for us and other viewpoints, as long as they're not threatening and as long as they're not dangerous. I can even understand where there could be some value, in those interactions, as uncomfortable as they may be. So, David, on that note, I want to thank you for making the time. I think this was a riveting and a critical conversation, and I look forward to sharing it with our audience.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.